I want you to do something with me right now. Like, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, just take a slow, deep breath.
So feel your lungs all the way up.
Yeah, exactly. And now let it out. You probably take, I don't know, about 20,000 of those breaths every single day without ever giving it a second thought.
Right, it's just automatic.
But what exactly did you just pull into your body? Because we tend to think of air as empty space,
Right.
like it's just nothingness.
You treat it like a void, yeah.
But it is profoundly physical. It's this soup of gases, sure, but it is also a swirling ocean of microscopic matter. And for most of human history, if the air didn't smell like a chemical fire or look like a choking black fog, we just assumed it was fine.
Which honestly is an incredibly natural assumption to make, biologically speaking. I mean, our senses evolved to warn us of immediate visible dangers.
Like getting chased by a bear or something?
Exactly. You see a predator, you run, you smell smoke, you know there's a fire. But our physiological alarm systems are completely unequipped to detect microscopic threats, especially ones that take decades of steady accumulation to do their damage.
We just don't have sensors for a slow-motion hazard.
We really don't. And that biological blind spot is exactly why we're taking you on this deep dive today.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are exploring one of the most monumental and really quietly revolutionary public health endeavors in modern history.
It's a story of incredibly patient, long-term science.
Yeah, it's called the Harvard Six Cities Study. It started back in the 1970s, and it took over 16 years just to gather the initial data.
16 years of just waiting and watching.
Right, and they tracked the intimate daily lives of thousands of people, and ultimately, it fundamentally rewrote the laws on what you and I are legally allowed to breathe.
And, the stakes here are fascinating because they are so uniquely ordinary.
What do you mean by ordinary?
Well, when we look at environmental history, the stuff that makes the front pages are usually like acute disasters. A chemical plant explodes, right? Or there's a catastrophic smog emergency that fills hospital ERs in a single weekend.
Like London in the 50s or something?
Yeah, exactly. But that is not the story we're looking at today. This is a story about ordinary air and ordinary American towns.
Invisible particles quietly shortening the lives of average people.
People who are just going about their daily routines, completely unaware of the risk.
So to really understand how our relationship with the air changed, we have to go back to a time when environmental science was still focused on those acute disasters.
Right, back to the early 1970s.
Yeah, and we need to look at the work of Benjamin G. Ferris Jr. He was a pulmonologist at the Harvard School of Public Health. And Ferris had this vision that was honestly incredibly audacious for its time.
Mostly because it required just a staggering amount of patience. Ferris was a pioneer. Until then, if you wanted to study pollution, you studied the extremes.
Right, like people living right next to a belching factory smokestack.
Or the workers inside a highly contaminated facility. But Ferris had this nagging hypothesis about the rest of us. He wanted to know what happens to the human body exposed to moderate, community-level air pollution.
Like a low-grade exposure stretching over 10 or 20 years.
Exactly, the chronic impact.
Yeah.
And to do that, his team couldn't just look at one single town. They devised this brilliantly structured analytical spine for their research.
Which became known as the Steubenville gradient, right?
Yes, the Steubenville gradient. They carefully picked 6 specific communities across the U.S. that represented a perfect spectrum of typical American air quality.
Because you need a spectrum to prove a trend.
Precisely. So on the absolute cleanest end of the spectrum, they chose Watertown, Massachusetts. Very low industrial pollution.
And then they moved up the ladder of dirtiness.
Right. Moving step by step up the particulate concentration, they added Portage, Wisconsin, then Topeka, Kansas, then St. Louis, Missouri, and Harriman, Tennessee.
And then we get to the anchor.
Yeah, anchoring the dirtiest, most heavily polluted end of the study, they chose Steubenville, Ohio.
And I think it's really vital we talk about Steubenville for a second, because we aren't talking about some apocalyptic wasteland here. This was 1970s America.
It was a bustling, proud, working-class town.
Right, sitting right in the Ohio River Valley. Heavy industry was the absolute lifeblood of that community. The mills provided the paychecks. They built the middle class.
And the air in that town, the soot, the smell, that was just considered the smell of money.
Yeah, it was just the normal, accepted atmosphere of a manufacturing hub. Nobody there considered themselves victims of an environmental disaster.
Not at all. They were living the American dream of that era. So Ferris and his team have this gradient to 6 cities. The next challenge is the methodology of actually studying the people living there.
And they decided on a prospective cohort study, which maybe you can explain that for us, because
Yeah.
if I'm trying to figure out what makes people sick, my first thought is to just go to a hospital respiratory ward, find the sick people, and ask them where they lived a decade ago.
Right, which is a retrospective approach.
Yeah.
And it seems easier, but it's fraught with problems.
Because human memory is terrible.
Yes, human memory is terrible, medical records get lost, people move around constantly. Retrospective studies are highly vulnerable to bias. You are starting with the outcome and trying to trace the breadcrumbs backward.
It's like trying to guess the plot of a movie from just watching the final scene.
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
A prospective cohort study flips that entirely. You start at the beginning. You gather a massive group of healthy people, you establish a baseline of their health, and then you follow them forward in time.
Like sitting down in the theater before the opening credits and watching the whole thing unfold.
Exactly, just watching to see what happens to them over years or decades. But to make that movie happen across 6 cities, the logistical mountain they had to climb is staggering.
Starting in 1974, they physically went into these communities. They knocked on doors.
They eventually enrolled over 8,000 adults into this cohort. And they weren't just taking names. The baseline data collection was exhaustive.
Detailed interviews, right? Occupational histories.
Oh, yeah. And physical pulmonary function tests. They literally had thousands of residents blowing into spirometers year after year to mathematically track their lung capacity.
Because if your core hypothesis is that the air in Steubenville is slowly killing people faster than the clean air in Portage, you already know exactly what the critics are going to say 10 years later.
They're going to blame anything and everything else. They're going to talk about confounding variables.
Right, the nemesis of observational science. Like, if I'm a lawyer representing a steel mill, I'm going to look at the data and say, well, of course my steel workers are dying younger. They have grueling jobs. They smoke more cigarettes. They eat a heavier diet.
They have different levels of education or healthcare access.
Exactly. A confounder is a hidden variable that correlates with both the exposure and the outcome, tricking you into seeing a false cause and effect.
So if the researchers don't track every single one of those alternate explanations from day one,
The entire 16-year study falls completely apart. It's the exact vulnerability they had to seal off. And to do that, statisticians use a process called multivariate regression.
which means holding those other factors constant mathematically.
Yes, they can look at the data and say, let's compare a smoker in Steubenville to a smoker in Portage with the exact same age, weight, and education level. They act like a sound engineer, muting the tracks for smoking, diet, and occupation.
Until the only audio track left playing is the ambient air pollution. Precisely. And while they're tracking the health of these 8,000 people, they are running a massive parallel tracking system for the air itself.
Right, from 1975 to 1988, they set up fixed monitoring stations in all 6 cities, just continuously pulling in air, running it through filters, measuring particulate concentration.
So you have 2 enormous data sets growing side by side, the biological reality inside human bodies and the physical makeup of the air floating through their neighborhoods.
But the bridge between the air monitor on a roof and a fatal heart attack in a local hospital relies entirely on a very specific, totally invisible villain.
We need to talk about what they were actually measuring, because the villain here goes by the clinical designation of fine particulate matter.
Which is universally known as PM2.5.
Yes, airborne particles that have an aerodynamic diameter of 2.5 micrometers or less.
Okay, let's ground that number in reality, because micrometer is a word that completely bounces off my brain. I have no intuitive grasp of that scale. How small is this threat?
Think of a single grain of fine beach sand. You can see it, right? That grain is about 90 micrometers in diameter.
Okay, sand is 90.
Now pull a single strand of hair from your head. The average human hair is roughly 50 to 70 micrometers across. PM 2.5 particles are 2.5 micrometers.
Oh, wow. So you could line up like 20 or 30 of these particles just to span the width of a single hair.
Exactly. They are so infinitesimally small that they're completely invisible without an electron microscope. Honestly, they behave almost more like a gas than a solid.
So why is that specific size, the 2.5, why is that the magic deadly number? If I breathe in a larger particle like pollen or campfire soot, what happens?
Your respiratory system is actually a brilliantly engineered fortress designed to protect your lungs from exactly that kind of debris. When you breathe in typical dust, your body deploys biological bouncers.
The nose hairs, right.
Yeah, the hairs in your nose are the first net. Whatever gets past them hits the mucosal lining of your throat. You have microscopic hairs called cilia that are constantly beating upwards.
Like a biological escalator?
That's a perfect analogy. They catch the soot, and sweep it up out of your airway so you can cough it out or swallow it. The body keeps the garbage out of the deep lung tissue.
But PM2.5 breaks the fortress.
Because they're so small, they just ride the airflow right past the nose hairs. They sail effortlessly past the mucosal escalator. They travel down your trachea, navigating the branching bronchioles, all the way to the alveoli.
The alveoli being the tiny air sacs at the very bottom.
Right, the delicate, balloon-like sacs where the actual magic of respiration happens, where oxygen trades into your bloodstream and carbon dioxide pulls out.
And because that barrier has to be incredibly thin to let oxygen through, the PM2.5 just slips right across the border.
It completely bypasses the body's defenses and enters the cardiovascular system. It gets right into your bloodstream.
That is deeply unsettling. The idea that microscopic solids are physically injecting themselves into my circulatory system, where are they even coming from? It's not natural dust.
Almost entirely the byproduct of combustion. Anytime humans burn something to generate power, heat, or move a vehicle, we generate fine particulate matter.
So coal power plants, diesel trucks, industrial manufacturing.
Yeah, the immense heat shears chemical bonds apart, creating these tiny, ragged, carbon-based particles that float away on the exhaust stream. It's the direct signature of the modern industrial economy.
And what blows my mind is that for the entire first half of this study, the federal government was completely blind to this specific threat. The EPA was established in 1970.
Right, the Clean Air Act passed that same year.
They had national standards in 1971, but they were looking at the totally wrong thing, weren't they?
They were regulating based on the science available. The 1971 standards focused on total suspended particulates, or TSP. They just put a filter out, caught all the airborne junk, and weighed it.
Treating a heavy piece of gravel from a construction site the exact same way as a toxic microscopic particle of diesel exhaust.
Exactly. They didn't have the resolution to target the fine fraction.
It's like trying to protect a house from disease-carrying mosquitoes by installing a heavy-duty chain-link fence. Sure, it stalks baseballs, but the mosquitoes just fly right through.
That's exactly it. They simply didn't recognize that the size of the particle dictates the biology of the harm. And that is why the Harvard team's work was so revolutionary.
Ferris, Douglas Dockery, Frank Spicer. They meticulously tracked this invisible PM2.5, cross-referencing it with the health files of their 8,000 subjects.
Through the disco era, through the 1980s, into the early 90s, patiently gathering data, watching people age, recording hospital visits, and logging death certificates.
And then the waiting finally ends. The massive data sets are compiled, and the statisticians go to work.
And the culmination of all that sent absolute shockwaves through epidemiology, public health, and environmental law.
In December 1993, Douglas Dockery and colleagues published their findings in the New England Journal of Medicine. And here's where it gets really interesting.
The paper had a very restrained title, An Association Between Air Pollution and Mortality in 6 U.S. Cities.
But the raw numbers were explosive.
Remember the multivariate regression. They controlled for smoking, BMI, occupation, age. They completely leveled the playing field.
And when they stripped away all the noise, the signal of the PM2.5 emerged. The residents of Steubenville, Ohio were dying 26% sooner than the residents of Portage, Wisconsin.
26%. It is a staggering mortality effect for an environmental exposure.
And to translate that into a lived reality, that's roughly 2 fewer years of life expectancy for the average adult in Steubenville.
We really need to pause on the human weight of that. These were over 8,000 real individuals.
2 years stolen from the end of a life, missing a grandchild's birth, 2 years of a hard-earned retirement that you never get to see. And they weren't dying in dramatic environmental disasters, no.
They were dying of cardiopulmonary disease and lung cancer. And we now understand the biological pathway. When those particles enter the bloodstream, the immune system recognizes them as foreign invaders.
So it sends out white blood cells to attack them.
Yes, macrophages. They try to consume and destroy the particles. But PM2.5 is often coated in toxic combustion byproducts, heavy metals, complex hydrocarbons. The macrophages can't break them down.
So the immune system just gets locked in a permanent state of high alert.
Precisely. It triggers chronic, low-grade, systemic inflammation throughout the cardiovascular system. Over decades, that inflammation slowly damages the inner lining of blood vessels.
It accelerates atherosclerosis, right? Hardening of the arteries.
Yes. It alters heart rate variability. It's a slow, quiet, invisible disease process that eventually manifests as a fatal heart attack, a stroke, or a lung tumor.
And the 1993 paper proved it wasn't just binary, right? It wasn't just Steubenville is dangerous, Portage is safe.
They demonstrated a perfect linear dose-response curve across all 6 cities. Every time the ambient concentration of PM2.5 went up by just 10 micrograms per cubic meter, there was a mathematically guaranteed increase in mortality risk.
A deadly staircase. The dirtier the air, the shorter the life. No exceptions. They pointed a statistically rigorous finger directly at the routine emissions of American industry.
But if you point a finger that accusatory at global industry, you can't expect them to just nod and accept it. The researchers had kicked a massive hornet's nest.
Right. You don't just tell the manufacturing sector they're shaving years off the public's lives and expect them to voluntarily spend billions to fix it.
The reaction was immediate and fierce. By 1994, major industry groups, like the American Petroleum Institute, mobilized to challenge the findings. And economically, it's totally logical. If the EPA regulates based on this, it costs them billions.
Redesigning engines, retrofitting power plants with massive chemical scrubbers.
Altering entire operational models.
And to be fair, if I'm facing billions in regulatory costs, my very first response is going to be, show me the math. How do you verify a study that relies on private medical data?
It's a fundamental demand in a democratic society. Reproducibility is the bedrock of science. But the Harvard researchers couldn't just hand over the data.
Because it's the private medical records of 8,000 citizens. You can't just publish their names, addresses, and smoking habits. They were guaranteed medical confidentiality under HIPAA.
It created a genuine crisis of scientific verification. How do you rigorously audit this without violating privacy? The regulatory apparatus was totally paralyzed.
But they found an unprecedented solution. They brought in the Health Effects Institute, or HEI. Can you explain what HEI is?
HEI's is incredibly unique. It's an independent, nonprofit research institute jointly funded by the EPA and the global motor vehicle industry. Half government money, half industry money.
A scientific Switzerland.
Exactly. Designed specifically to serve as a neutral arbiter for these high-stakes air pollution debates. So in the late 90s, HEI assembles an independent panel, completely unaffiliated with Harvard, led by an epidemiologist named Daniel Kresge.
And what Harvard did next is astonishing to me, given academic egos. They handed over the keys to the castle.
They gave Kresge's team full, unhindered, secure access to the raw, confidential data. 16 years of meticulous records. They essentially said, tear it apart. Try your hardest to prove it's wrong.
And Kresge's team spent roughly 2 years locked in a room with this data. They didn't just rerun the code, they subjected it to a brutal stress test.
They applied different analytical models, hunted for unmeasured confounders, looked for spatial correlation issues. They probed every potential weakness.
And in the year 2000, HEI delivered their final verdict. The suspense for Dockery and Ferris must have been agonizing.
The verdict was total and absolute validation. Kresge's team concluded the original mortality risk estimates were robust, the data collection was high quality, alternative models couldn't overturn it.
It survived the ultimate stress test. The link between PM2.5 and premature death was undeniable.
But knowing the truth doesn't magically scrub the soot out of the air. A peer-reviewed paper doesn't stop a smokestack.
Right, now the science has to navigate the slow turn of the regulatory machinery to actually change the air we breathe.
Which brings us to the Clean Air Act. It mandates the EPA must establish National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAQS, with an adequate margin of safety.
That phrase, adequate margin of safety, means building a buffer zone to protect vulnerable populations like children and asthmatics, right?
Yes, but the EPA administrator doesn't just pick a number out of thin air. The process is exhaustive. The EPA's Office of Research and Development synthesizes the 6 cities study, a massive parallel American Cancer Society study, and hundreds of other papers into an air quality criteria document.
Like a massive phone book-sized synthesis of all global literature.
Exactly. And then that document goes to the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, or KSAC, an independent panel of outside experts who review the synthesis and advise on the physical standard.
A pipeline designed to be legally bulletproof, which ultimately culminated in the historic 1997 PM2.5 rule.
For the first time in history, federal law distinguished fine particles from coarse ones. The new PM2.5 standard was set at 15.0 micrograms per cubic meter annually and a 65 microgram 24-hour limit.
It's wild to think how a single number, 15.0, translates into massive real-world action.
The economic and engineering mobilization was profound. State agencies had to force power plants to install billion-dollar scrubbers.
The auto industry redesigning heavy-duty diesel engines.
The petroleum industry radically reducing sulfur in diesel fuel. It literally physically rebuilt the infrastructure of the country.
But there was a lingering massive question the 1993 study couldn't answer. We knew dirty air took years off your life. But if we actually clean the air to meet these standards, do you get those years back?
This is the critical shift from association to true causality. Does removing the factor eliminate the disease in the real world? And that brings us to the massive plot twist, the 2006 extended follow-up.
My favorite part of the timeline. So it's the mid-2000s, the regulations have been taking physical effect. A researcher at Harvard, Francine Layden, leads a new team to look at the exact same six cities cohort.
They added 8 more years of continuous observation, and tragically, they had twice the number of deaths to analyze.
But the environment had fundamentally changed. PM 2.5 had fallen dramatically, mostly sharply in the dirtiest cities like Steubenville. So Layden's team wanted to know, did the mortality risk drop too?
And what they discovered is the healing gradient. The findings were profound. As the air got cleaner, mortality risk fell proportionately. It wasn't permanently baked in.
So what does this all mean? What did the math actually show?
For every 10 microgram per cubic meter decrease in mean PM 2.5 exposure, there was a 27% reduction in overall mortality risk.
27%. That perfectly mirrors the original risk finding, but in reverse. It means the intervention worked. Cleaner air demonstrably extended lives.
The regulations literally bought people more time on Earth, time with their families.
And this brings us to a profound philosophical realization about public health and why the work of the EPA's ORD is so easily misunderstood.
It's the concept of the invisible product, the core paradox of preventive science. Its product is the absence of harm.
Unlike a cardiac surgeon who saves a dying patient, where the triumph is visible and emotional, the 1997 rule didn't cure anyone in a hospital bed.
Right. It just meant thousands of fatal heart attacks and lung cancers didn't happen. Those tragedies were erased from the timeline before they occurred. They don't appear on any ledger.
It's a ghost statistic. The people whose lives were saved have no idea their lives were saved. And this dynamic is woven throughout environmental health history. Look at the phase-out of leaded gasoline.
Oh, absolutely. One of the greatest public health victories of the 20th century. For decades, we were burning lead in car engines, spraying a known neurotoxin everywhere.
Settling into the soil where children played. And the turning point was Herbert Needleman's 1979 study on kids with supposedly safe blood lead levels. He tested their shed baby teeth.
Brilliant methodology. He proved even low ambient levels caused cognitive deficits, lowered IQ, and increased behavioral problems. That empowered the EPA to push through the phase-out.
And by 1991, blood lead levels in American kids plummeted by 77%. But again, the product is invisible. It's millions of untenable IQ points never lost.
Children who didn't struggle in school or develop behavioral issues. We see the same invisible product with secondhand smoke. In 1992, the EPA classified it as a Group A carcinogen, causing 3,000 non-smoker lung cancer deaths a year.
And the EPA had zero regulatory authority to ban indoor smoking, but their rigorously verified science empowered local cities and businesses to pass clean indoor air laws.
Exactly. It transformed our culture. And we have to mention IRIS, the Integrated Risk Information System. Established in the mid-'80s, it synthesizes toxicological data on dangerous chemicals like arsenic to produce standardized risk values.
Which gives the government the numbers they need for Superfund cleanups. Slow, painstaking, but designed to be right.
But there's a vulnerability here.
Yeah, let me push back on this. If your success is entirely invisible, it is completely illegible to the cycles of political attention that govern funding.
That's the tragic irony. Success breeds complacency. When public health works perfectly, it looks like you didn't need to spend the money at all.
Politicians say, the air looks fine, why are we funding this research? And because it's invisible and relies on confidential data, this specific branch of epidemiology found itself in the political crosshairs.
Which brings us to the secret science controversy, running from roughly 2012 to 2021.
And I want to pause here. To you, the listener, we must remain entirely impartial here. We are not taking sides. We are simply reporting the arguments laid out in the historical dossier.
It is a profound, unresolved clash of values between regulatory transparency and human subject privacy.
So in the 2010s, culminating in a 2018 proposed rule called Strengthening Transparency in Regulatory Science, the six cities' data became a political target.
Let's outline the critics' argument, including industry and Trump-era EPA leadership. They argued that if you make major federal regulations affecting the national economy, the underlying science must be reproducible.
The raw data should be publicly available for independent verification. Relying on secret science is fundamentally undemocratic.
It's a potent argument. Science is built on reproducibility. But the scientific community, including Harvard's leadership, had a robust counter-argument based on privacy.
They pointed out the 8,000 participants were legally promised confidentiality under HIPAA. Releasing their medical and residential data violates massive ethical standards.
Furthermore, they argued the study was independently verified by HEI. It wasn't unverified, it just wasn't public.
And if they banned studies with confidential data, it would effectively ban all long-term human cohort studies from EPA rulemaking.
The proposed rule received over 600,000 public comments. It was eventually vacated by the Biden administration in 2021. But the tension between transparency and privacy remains an open historical question.
But regardless of the political battles, the physical reality of the air we breathe remains the legacy. And that brings us back to you, the listener. Every breath you take today is measurably cleaner, and your life is statistically longer because of a 16-year wait for data in 6 towns.
You are living the invisible triumph of public health.
But there is one final provocative thought we have to leave you with. The original standard was 15 micrograms. In 2012, it was lowered to 12. In 2024, it dropped to 9.
As monitoring improved, researchers kept finding negative health effects at lower and lower concentrations. The data suggests there might not be a safe threshold for fine particulate matter at all.
Any amount of combustion exhaust carries biological risk. So if there's no truly safe level of PM 2.5, are we as a society constantly just recalibrating exactly how much of our life expectancy we're willing to trade for the conveniences of modern industry?
Every time we order a package on a diesel truck, are we negotiating the price of our own breath? Science can measure the risk, but only society can decide what price it's willing to pay.
It's a heavy thought to carry. But thank you for coming along on this deep dive into these sources with us. Take a deep breath, appreciate the invisible work that keeps it clean, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.